We are live with SCI TV. I am Joshua Gordon of the Sports Conflict Institute. Today I am joined by a very special guest, Danish Qasim. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Josh.
So thanks for joining. I'm really excited about our topic today. With back to school, we start thinking a bit about some of the team formation issues and sports. And in particular, one issue that keeps making national headlines is hazing.
Right.
So let's start by way of introduction. If you could talk a little bit about why this is of interest to you in particular, and then we'll get into the topic.
Right. I think sports is very important because people from middle school to high school play sports, even elementary school, whether it's in intramural or just PE or even Pop Warner football. And throughout, we hear of many cases of abusive coaches, narcissistic coaches, and there's a lot of bullying that goes on in sports. And one of the worst manifestations of that is hazing. And I think this is something that widely affects people because of how prevalent sports are in our culture.
And so just so our audience has a grasp of what we're talking about, when you're at hazing, what are some of the behaviors that you're thinking about in particular?
So hazing, in many ways, is marginalizing other people, justifying it as some sort of rites of passage, as a way of proving self-worth. So, you'll hear of cases such as leaving teammates to be stuck with a hefty restaurant bill, or just not telling them of changes that happen on the team, to bad haircuts. So you have a wide range, but it's a way of really treating particular players or even a single player completely differently and in very, very poorly in behavior, antisocial type behavior.
Yeah, a lot of times people confuse bullying and hazing, and one very interesting way to think about it, at least from my perspective, is so bullying is really about trying to exclude someone from the team.
Right.
And hazing is actually, as you were saying before, a rite of passage. So
Right.
Part of the way you become accepted in the team is to go through these really uncomfortable steps or processes.
Exactly, yes.
And so some of the things you were talking about sound a little lighter, a bad haircut, these kind of things. Where is that sense of where the line should or could be drawn? Because I know one of the feedbacks we get, certainly from coaches at times, is that, well, we're just too sensitive these days, or people need to toughen up. It's all in good spirit, good fun. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, it's obviously going to be a fine line, and it's very hard to say this is where the line is drawn. And if it were that simple, we wouldn't really hear of these cases. So obviously, a restaurant bill, it's a very serious issue because some of these bills go up to $60,000. Now, if it's paying for coffee about $30, that's a lot lighter, and you could see it by the effects it even has on people. But even that, it could be something that is considered hazing, just depending on other circumstances. And there obviously has to be more evidence and a better understanding of the context to see whether it'd be considered hazing or harmless. For example, dumping rookies or something that's just in good fun, that would be one thing. But if it really isn't a way to otherize or to take shots at the dignity of players, and something that's really mistreating the teammates, which varies context to context, that would be closer to hazing versus just harmless fun.
And so when you think about a team, you have coaches and athletes both. Who, from your perspective, gets to define what's hazing and what's good fun?
I think it's for the victim to define it, and that's really something that we need to be more open in saying, that if the victim feels like it's hazing, then a line has clearly been crossed, and it's not really for others to silence the victim and tell him that, no, this is not hazing, or just accept it, this is a rite of passage. Because this affects the victim's self-esteem, affects the victim's self-confidence, and really hurts performance going forward.
That seems like a really critical point you're making, in that I think a lot of coaches think that they've been around the sport for a long time, and so for them, it's a more bright line about what is hazing, what is not hazing. Most coaches won't say they haze,
right,
or that they promote hazing. They'll say that they do team bonding, right?
Exactly. And team bonding should never be at the expense of an individual or of a whole class, like the rookies when they come in. I actually spoke with one former NFL player, and he was telling me how much he hated hazing, and he just mentioned being stuck at the restaurant with a large bill. And you have to understand, in the NFL, contracts are not guaranteed, especially a rookie. They don't know how long they're going to be playing for. So to be stuck with a bill about $50,000, that takes a financial hit on their salary and for the rest of their lives, because that's not money they're going to make for the rest of their career. So if it feels inappropriate, it most likely is. And players and victims should not be afraid to explore why they feel the way they do after hazing.
Where do you suspect a lot of these traditions come from that underlie hazing behavior?
I can't say where it comes from because we see it in almost every arena. I think maybe it's a way to show commitment. That's one idea I have. Or just, it was done to them, so keep it passing on, which still doesn't solve why it originally started. But I think it's just a tradition that really needs to be re-examined.
Yeah, and I think a lot of coaches seem very concerned that if we take out some of this behavior, that it's going to affect on-field performance, that in some ways the team's not going to be cohesive. And what would you say to that if a coach says, look, Danish, I can't stop some of these behaviors because it's how we become a team and we're ready to go to war together, and all the metaphors we have as sport.
Right. And I think that really goes back to the original point of it's for the victim to decide, or the object of that hazing, if you don't want to use victim, to decide whether or not it's constructive or destructive. Now, a better question would be if one person or a class, again, like the rookies, are feeling that they're being vilified, they're victims of hazing, and that's being ignored, what does that do for team bonding? In many cases, this becomes an excuse of just letting traditions go on and not creating change, which requires more effort. And it may not directly be linked to the game, but it definitely has a big culture impact on the culture of the team.
And you mentioned the coaches, threw a word around earlier in our conversation, the narcissistic coach. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why you think that's an important thought process in characterizing coach potentially around this issue of hazing?
Right. So a narcissist is one, to really reduce it, someone abide by the rules that others do. They have a sense of entitlement and they operate on that sense of entitlement, and will always find justifications for why rules don't apply to them. So in many cases, a coach will, and again, this whole discussion is a matter of understanding fine lines, because you're not going to find a clear definition of hazing versus having good fun. Likewise, yelling when a player messes up. There's yelling and then there's abuse. Now, if the coach is just angered and his mood is, or her mood is thrown off and then yells, that's one thing. But if it's consistent behavior, now you have. So a narcissistic coach, in such a case, if it's brought up, why are you yelling so much? Why do you harass and pick on one person? Why do you treat teammates this way? If you just start hearing justifications for why it's happening, because I'm the coach, because I know what's best for the team, that's a clear sign of narcissism. You don't see any compunction for the way that they treat players, for what actually happened. Rather, you just see justifications. So in a nutshell, it's being above the rules and justifying that through a sense of entitlement.
And certainly the legendary example always is Bobby Knight, former coach Bobby Knight. And a lot of times what you'd hear in his language after he had been screaming at a play or anything was, the language was about him. So you've embarrassed me.
Right.
It was less about them and their performance and trying to optimize performance in a way that was driven for their needs. It was always about his needs.
Exactly, and that's what a narcissist does, links his own or her own personal cause to the greater team cause. So making the coach happy is what's best for the team. Is what's best for the team, and it's very self-centered.
So when hazing happens, what are some of the consequences of this type of behavior happening around a team for those individuals who are victimized by it?
So, first of all, it creates a dysfunction in the team because a large segment of the team is ignored. And even if it's a basketball team, I mean, there's 12 players on it, even one or two of those, that's a significant percentage of the team. So to ignore one person's feelings or a class of people on the team, that's creating dysfunction. And to say that because you're a rookie, because you didn't make enough free throws in practice, you deserve this type of behavior. That's now linking performance to the individual. And that's just not a good way of thinking and a good way of moving forward as a team, especially when the set objective is to build team chemistry and to be stronger as a cohesive unit. This is destroying that cohesion.
Yeah, so the very thing that a lot of coaches and folks think are helping the team perform are really undercutting performance in a lot of ways.
Exactly, totally.
So what about, one of the things that you hear sometimes when you're talking with coaches or with athletes around this is that, look, we should not be treating rookies the same because they don't have the same expertise, they don't have the same background. We're trying to reinforce a culture. There seems to be some validity to a part of that. Where is that problematic? Where should that line be drawn? Because certainly you might not expect, on a professional level, a player who's been with the team for 10 years to necessarily be treated exactly the same as someone who's in their first month on the team.
Well, I think the question is, which values are they trying to reinforce? I mean, mentorship is always a good way to go. I know some teams now, they sign veterans or they'll have retired players back on the team to help transition rookies in. And I think that's a great way to teach the team culture. But if the team culture is built on hazing and not accepting the dignity of all players, that's a culture that needs to change. And this mentorship is a great alternative.
Yeah, so to be clear, we're not talking about things like, well, someone has a bigger locker than someone else, or someone has a better parking space.
Right. I think there's a truth to, or a valid argument for players who have been there longer, they get a better parking spot or something like that. But that's, again, giving special perks to one player isn't the same as picking on another player.
So when we read stories about hazing, and they happen 3-4 times a week this time of year that make national headlines, one of the things that comes out is that the behavior has been going on for a long time.
Right.
And it raises a question of, well, why did nobody do anything? Because it's not that these things were happening in isolation, but in fact, nothing was done by those bystanders who are around. What would you recommend that other teammates or assistant coaches or head coaches who see this behavior identify it as hazing? What should they be doing to help stop this earlier in the cycle?
And well, I want to say that's why I think Sports Conflict Institute is so important, because teams need training on how to be assertive and how to recognize this type of behavior and then do something about it. Many times people who are singled out, they really expect teammates to do something or to help out, or others higher ups in the organization, and nothing is done. And that is oftentimes the most destructive feeling and what leads to their despair of nothing is going to be done about this. And I would just say that awareness is the best first step, because people need to know what abuse is, when it's not okay, and there need to be trainings about that. And there's a lot of research on bystander effect, which is essentially shifting responsibility to somebody else. And players need to be trained, also teammates, that if a coach or another teammate is berating somebody, then they can't just be what's called a passive accomplice. There has to be some sort of checks and balances. And this is the biggest problem, I think, that not just in sports teams, but all companies face, when the HR department, who's supposed to do something when they hear complaints, they still have the organization's best interest in mind, and the narcissist is often the highest performer, so they won't do anything about it. And there's a lot of research on people just not being satisfied with the steps HR takes to solve cases of abuse in nonprofits and corporations. And it's been the same as we've seen in many sports bullying incidents.
Yeah, you can, in your answer, you can hear about the cycle that happens, because
right.
if what you're saying, it underlies a lot of where hazing or bullying are coming from. Well, if someone was a high performer, the behavior was given a little extra latitude. A lot of times these high performers go on later on to become coaches and other folks. So you can see that they were the ones who were given that leeway a lot of times.
And you see it's justified by, well, this person just likes to win so much that their emotions take over. And it's, given such a nice spinning that's just not needed.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think you or I are talking about trying to erode someone's competitive fire or trying to hurt their winning ways, but in fact, we're trying to support them.
Exactly.
So as we wrap this conversation, any final thoughts for folks as they're heading into the fall here and trying to think about what to do around this topic more? What would be your final thoughts to leave folks with as they try and make sure that they're not in a situation like this?
I think it's very important to not ignore red flags. This is many times victims, they realize later on that there were so many red flags. How could I not have put it together? And I think just embracing the red flags and realizing when something is wrong And digging further into that is very important. So if somebody is coming home from practice feeling worse and happy if the coach didn't yell today, so it was a good day, and the behavior is connected to how they're treated at practice. If the athlete is hiding from their parents how they feel about being on the team, if they feel like quitting, these are all just a few red flags that should not be ignored, and people should try to do something about it. First of all, themselves, by realizing it's not okay, addressing the issue, and not make excuses for that kind of behavior, because a lot of times these tactics are covert, so they're very manipulative and hidden. So it leaves somebody confused, and there's going to be a lot of justification here about, well, did the coach mean it when she said this? Did he mean it? So that kind of justification is a very negative spiral, and I would say to avoid that at all costs and really take ownership of the situation.
Yeah, fantastic insight. And I think I would also add that to the extent that a team can get ahead of these kind of conversations, the better. So as your team's forming, before you're in the stress and the tired part, where you're in a situation where someone's already uncomfortable, so if a team were to have a 15-minute conversation, not that different than the one you and I are having, Danish, it would go a long way to say, hey, what would hazing look like? How do we do it is, what should you do if you feel uncomfortable? Who do you go to? It's not a very hard conversation to have if you put a safe space for it, and it could go a long way towards making sure that season doesn't get derailed.
And I think that's something that's essential for every single team to go through different types of bystanders and how to not just be bystanders and let this abuse pervade. I think if they can recognize it and have ways to deal with it and create ways of talking about it, that would be very important, and that could really prevent hazing.
Well, thank you so much for joining. I really enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully a few people will be in a better place for having listened in on this as well.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.